Okay. All right, well, let me welcome you then, and introduce and welcome our speaker. So, Lydia Messling is a Leverhulme Trust doctoral scholar at the University of Reading, a sort of pioneer, if you'd like, in an exchange program that Max and her advisor Katrina McKinnon have set up, where we're hoping to benefit by some intellectual exchanges between our two programs. I'm working on issues in my field of political theory and regarding the use of science advisory panels. Her title, as you can see, Climate Change Scientists as Advocates to Tensions Between Scientific Independence, Poor Policy, and Avoiding a Dangerous World. Lydia is going to be here for another couple of weeks after this week. She sits downstairs and would be delighted to chat with anyone who's interested. So come and find her there. Otherwise, please welcome Lydia.
Thank you. Hi, thanks for having me. I understand because I tend to move around a lot. So yeah, as Steve said, I'm here to start off as an exchange thing, but to just explain a little bit of my background first. I trained as an environmental scientist at UEA in Norwich, and I was there when ClimateGate happened. The plan was for me to be a volcanologist, but the sorts of things that came out of ClimateGate, seeing my professors being told off for speaking to the press and things like that, got me thinking, well, why is that? Surely Mike should be fine to speak to people. And so I did a year abroad at San Francisco State University, and that's where I got more into the social science side and communication science. And so that's mainly my background. I worked for a bit before doing this PhD, mainly looking at behaviour change and communicating science to policymakers, but mainly the public. So my research is looking at, well, yeah, that's quite a dramatic title, but basically, how should climate change scientists navigate speaking to both like policymakers and members of the public about aspects of their science, but also like policy areas. I'm mainly looking at climate change for two reasons. The main one being is that's what I always wanted to study, and I feel a bit bitter that I'm no longer doing that. But the second is actually of all of the sort of science areas that you could look at, climate change is quite an interesting one in terms of the science is incredibly uncertain in places, and it's highly politicized. So the very fact that you exist as a climate change scientist, as you guys will know, in the United States, can be considered by some that you're making a political statement. That's not quite the same in other places. So just a crude dilemma summary of what it is I'm looking at is that we have experts who have knowledge. They get it. They've got to communicate that to other folk. The scientists aren't the ones that have been democratically elected to sort this thing out. So they can't go making the decisions. So they have to navigate trying to communicate to people who don't have the expertise what it is that's important. Particularly with climate change, it's this urgent and wicked problem, as Stephen Gardner talks about. It's particularly tricky for us to get our heads around. You know, psychologists talk about different psychological phenomena, such as psychological distancing, all of those sorts of things that just make it a particularly tricky aspect to get your head around. So what's a climate change scientist to do? On one hand, they really need to maintain their independence and integrity as a scientist when they are explaining these tricky things to non-experts. But on the other hand, like if they don't get across the sense of urgency or the things that need to be done, we're risking that we get policies that don't work, or people not taking action for other reasons. So if they're a scientist who is on the front line of seeing the dangers of climate change, how do they communicate that in a way whilst protecting their independence and trust? And so this is where advocacy, for me, kind of comes in, as that is part of my scientific training, but something I was told I should not go near. And speaking to other scientists, they have a different relationship with what counts as advocacy, what's okay advocacy, what's absolutely awful and is horrendous to the good name of science. So I decided to look into that. What's good and what's not, and how can we navigate that? So my PhD project is split into roughly 3 sections. The first section is the political theories, that's the values section. There I'm going into the philosophy of science, political theory, what roles should science play in society, what about the roles of values in science, different models of interaction between science and policymakers and the public, and seeing what it is that the theory says should be tricky for scientists, and what should be easy, to see really what what would be in breach of a scientific agreement with policymakers. Oh, sorry, go back. And then just looking at the theory for me, being a scientist, I like being in the field. So I decided that I want to actually see what it is scientists themselves think about advocacy and what tensions they experience when speaking to policymakers. Do they actively avoid certain situations? Are there situations where they feel that they might be risking their integrity and their independence? Are there other situations where they feel it would be completely fine for them to be quite bold about policy, maybe down the pub with a friend over a pint? So I've spent this last year speaking to 47 climate change scientists. I stopped at 47 because that's a lot of transcription. But also I was beginning to hear the same sorts of things, which as a qualitative researcher, to hit this saturation point is wonderful. So I'm really glad I hit that at 47 and not at 87. But I interviewed both climate change scientists in the States and in the UK. So my research won't necessarily be able to say anything significantly statistically significant about the differences between the States and the US, because it is only 47. But I felt that it was important to speak to scientists in, get rid of that.
Sorry about that.
No, you're okay. In both the UK and the US, because the political environment is quite different. And so that can massively affect whether an audience perceives you as being an advocate or not, and I'll come on to that. And then the third part, well, is what I'm kind of working on this year. So I'm in my 3rd year now of the PhD, the final year of funding, hopefully finish on time. And with this final section, I'm looking to bring together what it is the theory says and what it is scientists say themselves, and see if they match up. Great, and if they don't match up, why not? But to also learn about some practical things that scientists can do to speak to the theory, because the theory hasn't got a lot of these are good things you can do. So I'm looking to produce a set of guidelines for scientists that will basically say, if you're thinking about doing this, this is how you might want to think about doing it so you can do it well. I'm really not looking to tell scientists what to do. I think that's a really personal decision about whether they engage in advocacy or not. But just if you're not going to engage in advocacy, this is how you can make it clear to everybody that you're not doing that, and to really help them form clear communication pathways. So, the first thing I had to do was to define advocacy. Actually pretty tricky. There's not a lot of, well, there kind of is some literature on it in conservation biology. There's been some discussions on what advocacy is. But I came up with this definition. In that it's a plea in active support of something in order that others may be persuaded to act. For me specifically, advocacy is different from just lending support. It's different from me just being a member of Greenpeace, say, but it's also not manipulation. So it's not hiding things from people in order that they do a certain action. It's pretty much your lawyer in court arguing for you. It's that kind of advocacy. So in the literature that I did look at in like the political theory, it seems to be that a lot of people talk about advocacy as being a binary thing, something you either do or you don't. But actually, from my experience and from speaking to the scientists, this binary doesn't really work. And so that went out the window. Because, for example, scientists were saying, well, we're advocates already when we're advocating for funding. when we're advocating for our work to be presented, that's a kind of advocacy or self-promotion. So they didn't feel comfortable saying that they didn't do that at all. But there's also a possibility that silence can be seen as being a form of advocacy. And I don't really talk about it in this presentation, but I have a slide at the end if that's of interest to folk. I can talk about how I see that mechanism work. But yeah, it greatly depends on your audience and context. So some other folk, Hadley and Barnowski, came up with this other way of describing advocacy, and they split it into 3 types: no advocacy, or informative advocacy, or prescriptive advocacy. Informative advocacy, as it says on there, is you just arguing the facts. This is very much advocating for sort of evidence-based policy. That's what they would say. And the prescriptive advocacy is when you're advocating for other reasons. Maybe you have like an idea about what kind of economic system you want, and that will affect different other types of policy that you would advocate. But again, for me, these clear lines don't really work. So I reckon the boundaries aren't as clear-cut as they say. I think there's a blurring there that's important to recognise. We might never be able to exactly plot where you are in terms of what kind of advocacy, but the blurring is really important. And it also doesn't help distinguish between the types of prescriptive advocacy that might be acceptable and those that might not. So you might find yourself in a type of political situation where everybody has the same set of values. The action is very clear that you would like to do, maybe like the ozone hole. That was quite a clear one. So for that to be a type of prescriptive advocacy that the scientists engaged in, that's okay. So anyway, I came up with this, and I'd be interested in feedback on this. It's kind of worked so far, but this is specifically about policy advocacy. I'm not so much talking here about scientists advocating that science is a thing that should be cared about, which, from speaking to American scientists, that's what they said they spend a lot of their time doing. So this is a little bit different to that. I mean, I think we can all agree it's not really controversial for scientists to say my job's important, and we'd expect that from them. But this is specifically relating to climate change policy that comes out of their research. So I split it roughly into 4, and as you can see, the boundaries are blurred, but there's sort of different amount of blurriness. So the non-engagement, see that as your scientists that are sat in their lab just producing their journal articles, not engaging with policymakers or the public at all. Then the policy advice, that provides advice upon request, sort of speak when spoken to. They will fill in the gaps. So if you've got a question for the scientists, that's the sort of interaction that they will have with the public and the policymaker. The action advocacy is the, look, I'm a scientist, I see this as a problem, please, I'm begging you, do something. I'm not going to say what that something should be, that's specific policy advocacy, but I'm going to say, please do something. Business as usual is not acceptable. So there's a real difference here between being really prescriptive about what it is that should be done and saying something should be done. That's why I'm trying to tease out the differences there. And again, the boundaries are blurred, particularly between these last 2. But roughly speaking, advocacy, not advocacy. The yellow and orange are, for scientists anyway, a bit clearer to distinguish between the green and blue. So let me go back. Sorry, it's the jet lag. So when it comes to a scientist deciding what it is they're going to say, they might wish to plot themselves along the spectrum. When speaking to this policymaker, I want to make it really clear that I'm just giving them policy advice. The fact that I'm speaking to them means that I'm not engaging, so it's definitely not blue. But I don't want to give them any other forms of, push on that they should do something or that they should do something specific. And trying to plot yourself on this spectrum is a little bit like throwing a dart. So the scientist is throwing a dart at this spectrum, but when that dart is flying, different things affect where it lands. And the scientist can have some influence on that. So that's how I describe it. When a scientist speaks, they then throw the dart, the wind can blow it, and it could mean, depending on who it is they're speaking to, or what it is they're saying, or how they framed their message, they could end up sounding like they're on somewhere completely different on the spectrum. So an example of this might be if a scientist says something along the lines of climate change is a bigger security threat than terrorism. Is that really kind of policy advice? If they're communicating to an audience, maybe of security experts, that might chime with them and help them listen and take the scientists seriously when they're talking about risks. But if you're saying that to the general public, that could be quite emotive, bigger than terrorism. That could really sound like a form of advocacy, maybe that we should be doing something. So these are the different things that can influence when you throw that dart where it lands, and the scientists can have some control over limiting how much that dart gets blown off course. Again, I won't go into too much of all of these different things in this presentation, but it's just to say that when you, as a scientist, think you're saying something and plotting yourself on that spectrum, it's not. It's all part of a dialogue, and it's also about how your audience perceives you. So there's different tensions that you can experience in trying to place yourself on this spectrum. With these two on the end here, the non-engagement and policy advice, the theory suggests that the tensions that you might feel are that, well, you're a public scientist getting public funds, the public should have access to your work. For you to just be not engaged in any of this, there's actually maybe like a breach of your scientific ethics. You know, maybe you should be communicating this. That's what some people say. Also, there's the tension that policymakers have so many other things trying to fight for their attention. The fact that you as a scientist would just be saying, no, you really need to pay attention to this, might be needed. And again, yes, science can be a form of advocacy. So there are tensions why, as a scientist, you might not want to stay in those blue and green areas. You might want to think about going elsewhere, depending on how bad you think the circumstances look. Then the tensions, if you were to engage in this sort of area, they overlap, these tensions. Communicating uncertainties and complex science might mean making judgments about how you frame things, how you explain things, how you contextualize risk. And all of those things, again, can interact with people's worldviews, and that could be more salient for some people, could be seen as a form of advocacy. So again, it's not just policy advice, that could be pushing you somewhere else on the spectrum there. And again, the communication methods, you know, if you use a big red line on a graph that does that, the fact that you've got it in big and red, how that engages with us psychologically, is that a form of advocacy? If you did it in blue, you might engage with that completely differently. So there's some early research going on into this in the with a chap at UEA, whose name I've forgotten right now, but they've given some guidance to the IPCC, particularly on the 1.5 report. If you look at the summary for policymakers, you'll notice that the graphs look quite different, partly because of this. And again, the consensus dynamics, the political theory will tell you, you get a bunch of scientists in a room, it's not just straightforward in finding something straight for them to agree about. There's so many other things going on there, and also the tendency to just give conservative estimates. I'll move on to specific policy advocacy, and again this kind of comes a little bit further towards action advocacy, is that if a scientist were to start advocating for a really specific policy, say a specific carbon tax, or they're really, really keen on nuclear and going hell for leather and advocating that, there's a perception there that the scientists might be losing their independence and integrity in their science. Can you really trust them to not be politically biased when they do their science? Can you really trust them to give you a fair estimate on how well this will, you know, fare in real life? Are they tweaking their models to make this a thing that they really care about look better than it actually is? That's a real danger, and that is completely not allowed. That is political, that's values in science that we do not accept. That's Nazi science, that's eugenics, that's that sort of thing. So we don't want that. The risk to scientific integrity and independence as a result of that. And if some people say it risks further politicizing science. The scientists are seen to be getting political. And we want our science to remain pure and clean and away from all of these arguments. So scientists, please stay out of that because we don't want you to be tarnished. And again, the framing may alienate audiences. If you're pitching climate change, well, we can kind of see this with greenies, in the way that they frame climate change can actually actively alienate more conservative audiences. And so there's research being done on how you can do different frames to reach conservatives, to reach older generations or different religious groups that will include them rather than push them away. So that's a quick summary of the main tensions from the theory there. Communicating is a challenge. If you don't advocate, or if you don't at least make it clear that action is really needed, we could risk something greater. And so from that, I came up with these 6 key themes that I then took to my interviews. So I did these semi-structured interviews with climate change scientists, just talked roughly around these areas, and they just talked and talked and talked. I have so many hours to transcribe. It was great. And so I asked them to speak to these particular areas, what their concerns were, and how either they navigate these tensions themselves, or how they see their colleagues navigate it, or really not navigate it and make a hash of it. So these are like really early learnings from the data analysis, and as I said, I'm still finishing the transcribing, so I haven't done anything official yet in terms of looking at themes. But it worked. The advocacy spectrum, they liked it, and they understood the spherical model, which I didn't show this one at first because it's pretty ugly and confusing. And when I show it to my colleagues in the politics department, they just don't get it. But basically, what I'm trying to show with this spherical model is that all of these different places they have boundaries with each other. So in the line version, we didn't have a boundary between the non-engagement and action advocacy. And again, this is because silence can be seen as a form of advocacy. So that's why they needed to sort of come round and touch one another. And it also looks more like a dartboard, so the analogy works a bit nicer. But yeah, the question that came up from the scientists is, well, what about science communication? What about just me doing a really good effort in trying to communicate my science clearly? That doesn't really seem to be on this spectrum. But I would argue that SciComm is basically anything that isn't blue. Because whenever it is you are communicating your science, that could be seen as any one of those. The policy advice, action advocacy, or policy-specific advocacy by your audience. So, when you're trying to create a graph that is particularly engaging, what is it you're trying to particularly engage people in? And really think about your motivations, because that could mean that you're trying to persuade them of something, and therefore you're in danger of not just trying to communicate your science clearly, but actually straying maybe into some forms of advocacy. So that's where SciComm sits. And yeah, acceptable advocacy. I asked them, well, what's okay and what's not okay? And it really is dependent upon the context. Down your pub with your mates, that's all right. In front of the head policymaker of your country, talking exactly the same way you would with your mates down the pub, probably not as okay. So there's something here about the communication context that you're in, and this is particularly relational, I think. If you've got a relationship with a policymaker, they can know when you're particularly concerned about something, and they can hear that in your voice, and you don't need to advocate for them to know that. If you don't have that relationship, you don't have that, so that can be harder for them to know. Real-time event attribution science. I did not know how controversial that would be. So this is the, there's been a flooding event, we want to be able to say how much climate change contributed to that. Actually quite controversial amongst the scientific community. Some people say that's not real science, because it can't be falsifiable, or it's all dependent on your models. Some are even saying that maybe this is a form of advocacy science. And others are saying, no, this is just making it really relevant to people. So there's something there about, is event attribution science? What are the motivations of the scientists who do that? Are they trying to push an agenda here? Are they just trying to do really good psychon? What's going on? Yeah, independence and credibility. This chap came up a lot. Jim Hansen, always like a really good example for folk. But yeah, the really key thing that came out in pretty much every single interview is be really aware of where your expertise stops. And then, of course, you ask the scientists, well, how do you do that? And they go, but actually, that this is really, really important. If you're an expert in coral reef degradation, and you can really speak well about policy relating to that, then do it. Like, that's okay. It's within your area of expertise. But be aware that if you're advocating a policy relating to that really specific area of your expertise, it will touch on other areas that are not in your expertise. So either educate yourself, know where they are, know what the economic arguments are, know what the epistemic community thinks about those arguments. You know, don't just be taking some really weird fringe economic argument that no serious economist agrees with. Really think about how your expertise defines what it is you can and can't advocate. Credibility then is really important, because if you are seen as straying outside of your area of expertise or abusing your authority as an expert in that area, that's when it really annoys the other people in the scientific community. You know, if you're speaking out on an area that isn't really your area of expertise, saying, oh yes, I'm a coral reef expert, but you know, the cutting down all the trees in the Amazon is just as bad. And well, you're not the expert in that area. It's much better to be humble and to refer the journalist or whoever it is you're speaking to onto those experts who do know what they're talking about. But having said all that, before I say that, scientific status and prestige as well is really important. Come back. In that, Jim Hansen, here's our example. He was described by all the scientists as being like just really phenomenally good. Like, just because he speaks out and says something in policy advocacy, they're not then going to go back and question all the science that Jim Hansen has ever done and say, oh, well, it's all like a political manifesto. You're not going to discredit his science, because he has a body of evidence behind him that proves that he does the scientific method, it's been peer reviewed, it can stand the test of time, and it has stood the test of time. So some of the worry for scientists is that if they speak out, their science will be discredited and that they'll lose their careers. But for Jim Hansen, when he speaks out, his science hasn't been discredited, he hasn't lost his career, although maybe he was asked to move on. Anyway, but there's definitely something here about how your expertise, and with that, like your status. So you can be an expert, but if you're an early career researcher, you're a lot more worried than when you got tenure. So being a citizen then is also really important, that you have these opinions, you should be able to voice them. Speaking to people at NASA was really interesting. They felt as though they really couldn't on some areas, they felt really gagged. They talked when they do public lectures, that they found it helps when they take Steve Schneider's advice, and they state up front what their values are and what their motivations are for speaking. Like, as a mother, I'm really concerned about, or as a guy who plays squash on the weekends and I see you all driving here, I really care what you. To really state the values can help you say that because I'm a Christian, I think that we should care about the environment in this way and do these, or because I'm a liberal, I think we should do this. And people can understand that then. When they know your values and your motivations behind what it is you're advocating, they can more clearly separate that out from the something. So then I asked them about the ethics of advocacy. They're scientists, they're not ethicists, so there wasn't an awful lot on this from them. But a lot of them said that they really felt as though they should speak up more, but they didn't know how. And they didn't want to risk things, or they felt, well, now I've got tenure, I feel I maybe should help these early career researchers to speak up more. And so then the practical methods, how did they actually go about navigating this? It came up again and again that this sort of, hello, I'm a scientist, I give you my science and I walk away again. It just doesn't work. We know this knowledge gap just isn't how things work. And they were sensing a real need to get the community involved in this, but also for people to really understand how it affects them and how it affects them now. Which links onto another point that I'll talk about in a minute about having diversity in science. Where are young women? Where are people from Black and ethnic minorities? And yeah, that was really important. Again, speaking with authenticity was important. To build a credibility with an audience, and that can help you speak more. And then you need to go soon. Clear communication of the uncertainties. This is something that they always found hard, because you're trying to weigh things up and to know what works best. But there's some there's some new literature coming out on this, particularly for help with IPCC, natural scientists, and how you communicate uncertainties. But being realistic in what it is science can offer to society. It's not like 100% fact. It's always going to be uncertain. In fact, a really good scientist will tell you the possibility of gravity failing now. They're never going to say, when I drop this pencil, I'm 100% sure it will fall to the floor. No, a really good scientist will give you the 99.999% of that not happening. To be clear about what it is we can expect from science, and being clear about known unknowns, type 1 errors, type 2 errors, those sorts of things. And helping the public and policymakers understand that more. And then the role of consensus and speaking as a collective. So Jim Hansen, well-revered, famous scientist, for him to speak up on his own and get the personal attacks, his career behind him, means that he might get a few dinks, but he still stands pretty well respected. People might have different views on what it is he says about economics. But nobody's questioning his science. For an early career researcher doing that on their own, is their career over? Well, there's lots of mudslinging in that individual. People might talk about Michael Mann and Ben Santer and people like that who were singled out. But if you speak as a collective, as a consensus, as a union of concerned scientists, or as Mothers Against Air Pollution Outside Schools, or something like that, if you unite together, there's something that's a lot harder to challenge about that, and it's partly because it's harder to pick out an individual, but it's also an amalgamation of a diverse set of values. So when you're an individual speaking out, they can really pick up your worldview. It's because you're a Christian or you're a liberal or all these things, and they can sling mud at that. But if you've got a group of people where the values are quite diverse, like if you had Republican and Democratic scientists advocating for the same thing, you cannot just say to them, oh, it's because of your political affiliation. There's something a bit stronger there. So if you have a consensus where it's people from all sorts of walks of life, loads of different values at play, then when you advocate, it's a lot harder to attack that and say it's just your political opinion. And so then, finally, the additional things to the interviews that wasn't kicked up from these 6 points in theory really was the conversation in the US is different than in the UK. In the UK, we believe scientists. Let's not talk about Brexit, please, not Brexit. But in the US, I went to the Science March in New York, and just speaking to scientists there, they really felt as though advocating that science is the thing that should be taken seriously was what they were pursuing. But also the very fact that they existed as a climate change scientist, they said, I know, people think that's me making a political statement. Whereas, you can have conservative climate change scientists in the UK. The fact that you're a climate change scientist isn't seen to be making a political statement. So that's how they're quite different. I spoke to a Canadian scientist and he said, the Americans annoy me because they speak up too much. And the Brits annoy me because they don't speak up enough. Of course he's Canadian, he got it just right. The other thing then was diversity in science, and how it was really, really important that it's not just old, white, balding men doing climate change science. Because if climate change science stands up and they speak as one, and it looks all like old white balding men. It just sounds like the old white balding men point of view. So it's really important that we get different people from all sorts of walks of life, from all over the globe, involved in doing the science and speaking. And how that, because then if you have that diversity, it can bring credibility to your science, and help bust these myths of it's all just a conspiracy. It's all just how these old white men earn their money, right? Being paid to concoct this thing. So actually, it's really important that we can learn to disagree well with one another, but also unite around a common set of values. And part of the work is, well, what is it we can all agree upon, no matter what our race, our creed, our political views, and stand up and advocate for action for. And yeah, that's it. Thanks.
So Lydia's asked me to handle some of the questions, so I'm happy to do that. I'm director of the center too, for anybody who hasn't met here yet, but I think I've met those folks. I think she's done a fantastic job of illuminating a lot of different contours of these issues, so I'm guessing that it generates quite a bit of commentary or questions. So whoever would like to begin, we'll start with Matt Burgess.
Hi, really nice talk.
Thanks.
He is Canadian, by the way.
Yeah.
Oh, you got it just
So is
right.
Angela
You
sitting next to me.
know, Said it your way.
So, yeah, no. Well, I thought that. So I was wondering if what you heard and what your own thoughts are on the role of social media in some of these problems. Because it seems to me that before social media, if you wanted to, you had to have a certain amount of credibility in the way that, say, Jim Hansen does in order to appoint yourself a representative for science, which now that doesn't seem to be the case. And it seems like there are people who basically don't publish and tweet all day and appoint themselves representative
Right.
for science and tend to have very strong, very unhumble opinions about the superiority of their values. Bluntly. And so I wonder if that, what are your thoughts on that, and what if anything did you hear about that from your interview?
You know what? They didn't talk about social media a lot, actually. They talked more about. I suppose when they did talk about it, they're quite clear to work out, was their Twitter account something where they just communicate their science, or is it something where they communicate personal things as well? And so for a lot of scientists, they will use it they might even have to. But yeah, there's something here about audience and how you capture your audience. And before, to get your audience, you would have to have been reviewing the newspapers to be publishing about you. Whereas now you have access to a whole different type of audience. So the danger there is that a lot of scientists were aware that when they are publishing on social media, that it is to their echo chamber, and really conscious that, oh yeah, did you see this thing that Ed published and it went viral? Yeah, Ed, it did go viral. He's my supervisor. It did. It was at the Olympics, the thing that he did. But mainly within the climate change community. My mum and dad hadn't heard of it. So I think there is a danger that even though they have access to an audience much more easily through social media, there's a very particular type of audience. So I think the problems still remain in terms of who it is you're trying to speak to and have access to.
Great. Thanks, Lydia. Another question. We have a Matt. Would you just introduce yourself to the group as you ask your question too?
Hi, my name is Jeff Rowe. I was a master's student here in telecom and engineering science background. So mine's kind of a two-part question, but they're both related to the online, or we're seeing a huge level of online posting and almost addressing your credibility, issue to a certain extent. And the first is how does a scientist, what can help a scientist establish credibility without being perceived as an egomaniac online? And the second part of that is perhaps counteracting sort of scientific gaslighting.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I'm kind of transferring that from a regular social environment, but gaslighting is almost a personal attack where you're trying to make the author feel socially inadequate. In other words, someone may respond not rather than addressing a scientific issue, they say your opinion is laughable, or they'll try to attack you personally to make you feel that perhaps my opinion isn't valid in a certain situation.
So sorry, is your question, how do you handle gaslighting? How do you
Oh, well, yeah, I'm kind of wondering how it
ties into?
works into the credibility equation with this. And this is newer stuff. I noticed a lot of your citations were like from 2010, 2011, but you know.
For a lot of the theories stuff, there's more stuff coming out.
And that makes perfect sense. But you know, nowadays, particularly in the Twitter generation, we're starting to get almost one-liners out there where people are more concerned about winning rather than validity.
Yeah, for sure. So again, like my research didn't really look at what specific types of communication methods the scientists use. So I didn't ask them a lot about their social media use. More like, are you comfortable with talking at all, was what I was looking at. Not necessarily how do you then talk or what forms, because it felt as though it was important to establish why do some of you not talk at all, or what limits you. But in the how does a scientist establish the credibility, particularly online, from what I heard from other scientists, a lot of it is about humility, and being honest about the limits of your expertise. And ultimately, the way that a scientist gets their credibility is from doing really, really good science. Your authority and credibility comes from the fact that the science that you do follows the scientific method. It goes through peer review, and you get published in revered journals. You are willing to admit when you get it wrong. You have your, you go. That's the scientific revolution. That's how you get your credibility. It's not you as a person. You could be a horrible racist, but your science could be still credible because you followed the scientific method. So in that sense, be really careful when you're trying to borrow your authority and credibility from science as a whole. You see some people try and do that. So I don't know the answer about how to build your credibility online. I think be careful who it is you're quoting. That's really important. How do you deal with gaslighting? Yeah, I spoke to a Republican climate change scientist who was telling me how it's so awful, all these people mudslinging at them, being horrible to them. And then at the end of the interview proceeded to tell me about all these people that they really hated and why they thought they were just mentally ill. Oh, well, pot kettle black. I think part of it is, that's why I'm not going to be telling scientists what it is I think they should do. That's a really personal decision, because I think to get that sort of public attack, unfortunately, it's probably inevitable, and you've got to learn how to handle that.
For example, I use citations. So that's something that you don't see a lot online, is people actually citing their work.
If somebody's not citing, I don't believe what they say.
Right, well, this is more of a Facebook environment, not quite a real scientific debate. It's sort of a pseudo one.
Could you introduce
Yes,
yourself?
I'm Jonathan Cabot. I'm in both philosophy and in geography, pursuing ultimately a PhD in climatology. And so one brief point on the Twitter comment is that there was a satellite that was recently launched, and to get funding to go be a part of it, they checked to see how many followers you had. Part of the qualifications for getting the money to go to California and see the launch and everything was how many followers, so that you could be person that produced content that a lot of people would see. Anyway, side note.
Get your Russian bot then.
So I did not have enough followers to get them. But I will say I'm really grateful to hear someone that's looking at the intersection of philosophy and of science, particularly physical science, because that's certainly my interest. But, you know, a little bit like more superficial question is when you had a slide up there that talked about when engaging people, sort of like know the context, like understand your audience. So when I talk to people about climate science, if I find out just straight off the bat that they have the kind of cliche set of like, well, the Earth's always been changing, who are we to think it's us, and all these other positions, that I try to kind of tune my discussion towards like the few little points that we can come to agreement about. And sometimes when I do that, though, I feel like I'm being not even dishonest, like I worry about my scientific integrity, but rather that like even on a personal level, I'm literally being like a fake. Like I'm trying to cater to those types of positions. And so I'm just curious in your research if that's an addressed point of like the threshold at which like we stop kind of catering to or entertaining just quite obviously false or otherwise you know, points of which are conflictual with the elemental facts on the ground.
Good question. Yeah, I think I didn't talk much on that, but there's some fantastic work. Catherine Hayhoe talks really well on this, and there's others. You know, how do you engage these different audiences? And yeah, there's some great literature out there on these sorts of things. I think this is really important to think about. You know, you personally holding this tension. You want to engage this audience, but you know you fundamentally disagree with them. But I'm sure we can all think of family members that maybe at Christmas or birthdays we might disagree with, but there's something about the need to have a relationship with that person. You can start off initially, as you say, doing exactly what it is you've described, finding those key points that you can agree upon to warm them up and go, actually, this might be something that they might agree with, or they can see the effects happening. But you're right, ultimately, there comes a point where you can risk framing out the heart of the issue. If you're just talking about all of these, well, yeah, if you go environmental, you can save money, you talk about all of these side issues, you're in danger of not really talking about the real thing that might be at conflict with their core values. At some point, I think you have to broach that. But again, it's learning out how to disagree well and to say, well, look, I have these values and I believe we need to do this. I think if you do that initially, people just won't interact with it. If you've established a relationship with them, you've got something in common with them, they can trust you, they might be more willing to consider their worldviews and the challenges that are there. Worldviews are very, very hard to change. Not impossible, but very hard.
Would you say that most of Catherine's work is to help people deal with the religious discussions? Is that kind of what she's...
I'd say that's a really large aspect of what it is she does, but I've heard her speak quite a few times, and a lot of what she does doesn't mention religion at all. I'd say she's particularly gifted at being able to very quickly identify what motivates people, to form a quick relationship with them, and then to speak to them in a really personal way. But yeah, not a lot of the time that isn't religious.
Thank you. Great. I saw some hands here. Would you introduce yourself to the group too?
Hi, I'm Christina Stone. I'm working communications right now. I'm with drought.gov, but I'm a CU builder. This could be a yes or no question, but I was just curious what, if it came up, non-scientists advocating for scientists, or we talked about when you're an expert in one region, venturing outside of your expertise, specifically people like Al Gore, Neil deGrasse Tyson, Bill Nye, whenever it came up.
Good question. Didn't come up. I very specifically focused on interviewing natural climate change scientists, not social scientists.
Oh, sorry, I meant...
Because, yeah, I'll come to it.
Okay.
Because of the role of values in the work that they do. It's very common still to speak to natural scientists and they say, my science is completely objective. And they would then appreciate these boundary organizations or translators or bridges, like these people who would then take their work with their meaning that they can keep a distance from it, but it can still get out there and see that as like a distribution channel. I have mixed feelings about those people myself, but that might just be the people themselves rather than what they say. Yeah, let's hear that. Yeah, they didn't really talk about it, unfortunately.
No, that's good.
Yeah, it's a different dynamic, I think, because the threat to them isn't the same as scientists being accused that they've got values infiltrating their work. That's my sense.
You've got mixed feelings too, I know. Grant, right there. Would you introduce yourself to the group too?
Yeah, I'm Grant Couch, and I work in politics, and I work the right side of the aisle, and I'm advocating for climate. And one of the things when I speak to people is I touch on a lot of things you talked about, and I think you did a fantastic job of summarizing and covering all of those areas that scientists need to be sensitive to. So beautiful. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
I too share that same mixed view of those transitional groups.
Mm-hmm.
Because unfortunately, in my opinion, many of those groups, if not most of those groups, don't abide by the lessons that you were mentioning and that Catherine Hayhoe speaks so well about. It's a shame. We need to find that common ground. We can, and we are making progress, but very well done. So I'm glad you're doing the work. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Great. Ryan, I saw you had your hand up.
Yeah, so this is kind of a personal question. I hope it comes out right. So if I may interpret a little bit of what you're saying, for scientists, you advocate for them advocating in healthy, balanced, thoughtful ways. Have you found it difficult? So that's taking subjective or objective science and then advocating later. For your own work, is it hard to work backwards? You're studying advocacy. Do you struggle at all making it?
Yeah, I'm so screwed up. Yeah.
Or objective, excuse me, objective.
Yeah. So, yeah, completely. So, to clarify, I'm an advocate of a scientist thinking well about these things, not necessarily advocating that they advocate. I'm advocating that there is a thought structure that they can work through to process their feelings and their values and how it is they feel as though they should speak up. Partly because that was my experience as a scientist undergraduate, is that there was nothing for me to think about the social justice issues that I was seeing. There was no guidance on how to process those feelings or the anger that I was feeling about some of the lectures I was getting on oil. So I'm an advocate that there is something there for scientists to structure how it is they then decide to communicate and then to communicate that well. Because some of them engage in what they think is policy advice and it's just, how do I say this? Basically, there are some scientists that you don't want anywhere near policymakers. So that's why I'm saying not all of them. And for me personally, yeah. And for me, it was trying to explain to my mum what it is I was doing with climate change and how I would never accept a lift off anybody driving a big 4x4 car because they're gas guzzlers. And she would say, but what if you're stranded on the side of the road? Or what about the people who need to cut down those trees to eat? And it was the social justice issues that got me interested in doing this. And yeah, I'm a climate justice scholar. And for me, I think it's an important part of our democracy and for climate justice that scientists are in this conversation. So yeah, I have to be really careful that I'm not saying, everybody get out your soapbox and your fun banners and let's march.
Jenny, you had your hand up, and then we'll go to Joel next. Ryan, I didn't make you tell everybody who you are. Would you just do that real quick?
Yeah, I'm Ryan Vashon, a past climate scientist who's turned into science communicator, mostly for film.
Always a scientist.
Fair enough. We're all scientists.
Hi, I'm Jenny Briggs. I'm in a similar niche as Ryan, scientist by training, working in outreach and collaboration with scientists now. And I actually grew up in the UK, but then I've recently worked for the federal government in the US. So I agree with many of the themes and kind of summaries that you put forth about those different groups. And I'm really curious whether the British scientists commented on sort of the fact that their role is one that includes more trust perhaps from their publics. In Britain, as you said, are they feeling more inspired to communicate and advocate more, sort of given the craziness in the US in that arena? Or I don't know if you've got into that kind of back and forth dynamic. And then did you take into account just the general cultural comfort with speaking about ourselves that sort of differs between the two countries and that side
Sure.
of things.
Sure, yeah. So, suppose the first thing to say is, with my qualitative research, it's not really generalizable, so I can't draw out anything statistically significant between the differences. I just really wanted to make sure that I was speaking to a whole spectrum of folk, hence choosing UK and US. And actually in those institutions, I was speaking to people from loads of different countries as well. So from the 20 or so scientists that I spoke to in the UK, some of them, when I talked about the American situation, they felt compelled to support their fellow brothers and sisters over the pond. And we're just really grateful that that wasn't the situation that we were in. I think with the UK government agreeing to the Paris Agreement puts a different political situation for UK scientists where they go, right, it's quite clear that the government have said that they're doing this, therefore we can kind of draw a line under that and then talk about what it is they need to do the thing that they've agreed to. I think seeing what's going on in the States certainly made UK scientists reflect more on their own situation. I'm not sure if it inspired them to advocate more, but I think it certainly made them think about this as something that they might want to do more. And the cultural differences, again, not really like a big enough sample to take that into account, but having lived in the States previously myself, I kind of am familiar with the different ways in which Brits really don't express themselves and Americans do. With the forms of conversation that we were having, actually we were able to very quickly get down to these issues, and the UK scientists did open up pretty quick, which I was really surprised by.
Yeah, great, thank you.
So turn to Joel Smith. This may be the last chance we have for a question. We can turn to you if we've got time, Sam. I am pleased to say again, as Steve Vanderheide mentioned at the beginning, that Lydia is with us for the next weeks. And so if we don't have a chance to address it here,
Please do, I'm quite lonely.
Over to you, Joel.
Okay, so I'm Joel Smith. I've been involved in IPCC work with too, and I'm a consultant in town. And I think this is a great talk. I like the typology, very interesting. It'd be interesting to play a parlor game, maybe throw names at you. But I have more of a normative question. I'm curious because, there's talk about science advocacy for policy. Is the topic of advocacy for appropriate understanding of the issue?
Sure.
And using the science appropriately, but not necessarily for specific outcomes, just making sure that, the people are saying, you're Trump on 60 Minutes as an example. That kind of garbage is refuted, but if people take it seriously, we hear more what, a colleague back here is pushing for, but maybe people pushing for different outcomes, policy outcomes.
Yeah, sure.
That come up.
Sure, yeah. So, firstly, just in response to your parlor game thing, what's interesting is actually it's when you throw that dart and placing somebody, it's very, very limited in time and space and context. So what they say in that op-ed could sound like policy advice, but when they're on the streets, it sounds like specific policy advocacy. So as an individual, you're never just in one place along that. There is maybe some discussion to be had about if you're seen as being a specific policy advocate and you're on that far right-hand side of the spectrum, can you ever get back to the left-hand side? Or are you always going to be seen as an advocate? So there's something there about hopping along this line. Can you ever go back? I don't know. Something to think about. So scientific understanding. There's a lot of conversations, particularly with the US scientists, about scientific education being the thing that they would really advocate, particularly in the school system, so right at the beginning. We need to have a better understanding of science. How can you expect the politician to have an understanding if it wasn't there in the schools? And so actually most of the conversation centered around scientific understanding, what it is it can offer, but also understanding of the risks, and if people had basic math, maybe they could understand some of these risks. That was a big thing for US scientists, not so much UK scientists. And I think to clarify again, my spectrum is very specifically related to policies that might come out of the science rather than that science is a thing. I think that's pretty uncontroversial for scientists to advocate for. But it can be linked again to kind of other types of policy. Yeah, there's no clear-cut lines is what I've learned in all of this. And being a geologist, I really wanted clear-cut lines, but I didn't get any.
Do you want to ask a very short question?
Just to wrap up on this subject, my background is in paleoclimatology, but I have since been working directly within the office of elected officials, which is a fascinating place to be. And I wanted to ask what conversations either do the scientists themselves have, or have you taken away from for what are effective and appropriate formats and platforms from which scientists can advocate as a consensus. When you talk about credibility, we might all understand when someone has good papers and who is an expert that way. Our elected officials have no idea how to tell who's an expert in the first place. So it doesn't even matter if they're publishing. It's if this person knows them and thinks that they trust them. So you have things like Union of Concerned Scientists, which then folks might lump in with advocacy nonprofits like Sierra Club or Planned Parenthood or anybody else. And then scientific societies, which sometimes are very hesitant, versus national academies or universities, which their lobbying shops are almost entirely dedicated to what does the university need financially and not what can the university provide.
Right.
What have the conversations come out of either that you've had with scientists for ways in which they think they could actually come together to organize their advocacy as a consensus? And what are your takeaways in terms of what would be effective ways to organize the scientific community to have an authoritative, consensus-driven policy or just advocacy position, whether it's science education or climate change or anything else?
So we didn't really talk about what groups they were involved in.
No.
I was told as an undergraduate, don't join Greenpeace because I won't get a job. So there's very much a feeling that if they form a consensus group behind a particular organisation, that could tarnish them and their science, which is like the whole worry that that this organisation might then advocate for issues that they don't actually advocate on. So I think, therefore, it's important that if you are going to advocate on an issue, that it's a really specific issue. And there's something here in community organising, right, in terms of how do you lobby people, you unite around a really common issue, you have an understanding. So if there was a really specific policy, they could then organise getting people around that. I think there is obviously roles for these NGOs and these boundary organisations to play, but they're always going to carry the baggage of whatever it is they've said before and how it is people have received that before. And it's important that you get a diverse group for to build that credibility and what it is you look like. So I don't know. I guess social media might play a great role in that. And then it's the credibility, as I said, is the difference between having a credible individual, but the credibility is actually in the science. So if you've got all of the citations, if you've got the evidence behind you, you're advocating with that, that's where the credibility is. To just say, oh, I'm Jim Hansen, therefore believe me. No, he's credible because of his science. So therefore don't confuse credibility of the individual with credibility of the science that we want to be building the foundations of this advocacy on. If that makes sense.
No, I advocate and speak for the need for there to be that scientific consensus, not coming from the outside, but from within government. And from ways to establish either science advisory councils, so that way when you talk about where's the dollar coming, it's public dollars from a public face with a public organization,
Right.
which is then brought in explicitly by of the government
Yeah. I
to
think it's got to
do
be
science
roots.
advocacy.
It's got to be the scientists doing it themselves, because if somebody else is imposing that organisational structure on them, it's always going to be suspicious of what those motivations and the fundings are, whereas if it's the scientists doing it themselves, but they have no time or money to do that, that's the most credible.
Well, this conversation could deservedly continue. Thank you all very much for coming along. Please make the next video reach out to her during the time that she's here, and come back next week. David Unk, who's sitting there quietly, he's going to be giving his thoughts. Next Wednesday at noon. Thanks a lot.
Good to see you. I think I saw you in the conference.
Yeah, that's my
It's a great question.
Yeah.